First-class cabin chaos erupted as billionaire Jameson Hayes' infant daughter screamed for 3 straight hours. Flight attendants failed. Passengers fumed. Then, impossibly, silence fell as a black teenager approached from economy. The lead attendant rushed to intercept him, tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been on a flight with a crying baby. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how this unexpected encounter changed multiple lives forever. ## Part 2, The Setup. Jameson Hayes, the 42-year-old white founder and CEO of Hayes Technologies, sat in Seat 2A of the first-class cabin on United Airlines Flight 1459 from San Francisco to Boston. His company had revolutionized artificial intelligence algorithms, making him a billionaire before 40. His perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit contrasted sharply with his disheveled appearance, hair unkempt, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, expensive silk tie loosened around his neck. On his lap, 9-month-old Lily wailed inconsolably, her tiny face bright red. Her pacifier had been ejected for the dozenth time, her designer baby outfit now rumpled and stained. Hayes bounced her desperately, a man clearly out of his element despite having mastered the tech world. "Shoo, Lily, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with fatigue and embarrassment. "Daddy's trying." The truth was, Jameson Hayes had been trying for 9 months, ever since his wife Catherine had died from complications during childbirth. The man who could solve complex technological problems that stumped the brightest minds in Silicon Valley couldn't figure out how to comfort his own daughter. 3 rows behind him sat Harold Bennett, a 65-year-old white real estate mogul from New York, whose scowl deepened with every wail from baby Lily. He repeatedly pressed the call button, demanding that someone do something about that noise. His Rolex flashed as he gestured emphatically. "This is first class," Bennett hissed to anyone who would listen. "I paid $12,000 for peace and quiet, not this insufferable racket." Moving through the cabin was Tiffany Carter, a 37-year-old black flight attendant with 15 years of experience. Despite her impeccable service record and professional demeanor, she had been passed over for senior positions multiple times, watching less experienced white colleagues ascend to management. Today, she navigated the increasing tension in first class with practiced diplomacy. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, approaching with a warm bottle. "Would you like to try this again? Sometimes the cabin pressure affects their ears." Hayes took the bottle gratefully, but Lily turned her head away, crying even louder. Bennett rolled his eyes. "Can't control his kid. Typical. Probably doesn't even have a nanny." Tiffany's jaw tightened slightly, but her smile remained fixed. "Sir, babies cry sometimes. We're doing everything we can." Meanwhile, in seat 32F of economy class, 17-year-old Malcolm Johnson sat with his well-worn headphones around his neck. Unlike most teenagers who would have cranked their music to drown out the baby's cries, Malcolm had removed his headphones half an hour ago, listening intently to the pattern of the baby's wails. His dark fingers tapped a rhythm on his armrest, his brow furrowed in concentration. Malcolm was traveling to Boston for the most important audition of his life, a scholarship opportunity at Berklee College of Music that could change everything for him. The youngest of 5 children raised by a single mother in South Chicago, Malcolm had shown remarkable musical talent from an early age. His saxophone case, containing an instrument purchased through years of neighborhood fundraisers, was safely stowed overhead. But Malcolm's talents extended beyond music. After his mother fell ill 3 years ago, he had become the primary caretaker for his 3 youngest siblings, including a colicky baby brother. He had developed a nearly magical touch with infants, discovering techniques that even experienced parents hadn't mastered. As the baby's cries intensified, Malcolm recognized a pattern he knew well, the specific pitch and rhythm that indicated ear pain and overtiredness, not hunger or a dirty diaper. The flight attendants were trying the wrong solutions. He glanced toward first class, knowing the unwritten rules that kept people like him firmly in their designated spaces on planes. But something in the desperate tone of the baby's cries compelled him to act. He unfastened his seatbelt. The older white woman next to him looked surprised. "Where are you going, young man?" Malcolm nodded toward the front of the plane. "That baby needs help." By hour 3 of Lily's nonstop crying, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had deteriorated from annoyance to outright hostility. What had begun as sympathetic glances toward Jameson Hayes had transformed into glares of contempt. The constant high-pitched wailing had worn through everyone's patience like sandpaper on thin wood. "For God's sake," muttered a businessman trying to work on his laptop. "Can't he afford a nanny? Why bring an infant on a cross-country flight?" A woman with a silk eye mask pushed up on her forehead turned around in her seat. "Some people shouldn't be parents if they can't control their children." Harold Bennett was by far the most vocal about his displeasure. He had progressed from pressing the call button to standing in the aisle, blocking Tiffany as she tried to navigate the cabin. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he said, voice raised to carry over Lily's cries. "I've flown over 2 million miles with this airline, and I've never experienced such incompetence." Tiffany maintained her professional composure, though the strain showed in her eyes. "Sir, please return to your seat. The seatbelt sign is still illuminated." "Not until someone addresses this situation," Bennett insisted. "I've watched you people fumble around for hours without a solution. It's clear to me that neither this so-called father nor the crew knows what they're doing." The coded language wasn't lost on Tiffany, who had endured variations of "you people" throughout her career. She noticed how Bennett's eyes lingered on her braided hair, neatly tucked into a bun, before dismissing her authority. "Mr. Bennett, we're doing everything possible," Tiffany replied firmly. "Babies cry. It's developmental and normal. Well, perhaps in some communities it's acceptable to let children run wild," Bennett said with a sneer, "but where I come from, parents know how to maintain control." A flush of anger warmed Tiffany's cheeks, but 15 years of customer service had taught her to swallow such provocations. Instead, she turned her attention back to Hayes, who was now standing and pacing the small area near his seat, jiggling Lily desperately. "Mr. Hayes, would you like me to hold her for a moment while you take a break?" Tiffany offered. Hayes shook his head, a wild look in his eyes. "No, no. She's my responsibility. I just don't understand what's wrong. She's been fed, changed, burped. I've tried everything." Meanwhile, in economy class, Malcolm Johnson continued listening to the baby's cries, recognizing subtle changes in the pattern. To his trained ear, the high-pitched wailing with short gasps indicated pain, likely from ear pressure, combined with exhaustion that had pushed the infant past the point of self-soothing. Malcolm had witnessed this exact phenomenon countless times with his youngest brother, DeAndre, who had suffered terrible ear infections as a baby. Malcolm had developed specific techniques to help, techniques his mother called the magic touch. But as Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, he felt the familiar weight of uncertainty. The invisible barrier between economy and first class represented more than just a difference in seat width and meal quality. It was a boundary he had been taught never to cross. Last summer, Malcolm had entered an upscale music store in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood to look at sheet music. Within minutes, a security guard had appeared at his shoulder, following him closely between the aisles. When Malcolm had asked to see a particular book behind the counter, the clerk had requested he provide a credit card, just to hold, while he examined it. The message had been clear: people like Malcolm were presumed out of place, and potentially criminal, in spaces of privilege. As Malcolm moved toward the front of the plane now, he felt eyes tracking his progress. An older white man frowned, pulling his laptop bag closer as Malcolm passed. A flight attendant different from Tiffany, younger, white, with a blonde ponytail, stepped into the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, voice tinged with suspicion. "The lavatory for economy passengers is toward the back." "I know," Malcolm replied softly. "But I think I can help with the baby." The flight attendant's eyebrows rose. "That's not your concern." Please return to your seat." Malcolm hesitated, the baby's cries piercing through the cabin. He thought about turning back, about the risk of creating a scene. His saxophone teacher had always warned him, as a young black man, you don't get the luxury of being perceived as just making a mistake. Always think twice. But then he thought of little DeAndre, how he'd suffered until Malcolm had discovered the combination of movements and sounds that would soothe him. He thought of his mother working double shifts while he figured it out through trial and error. "I understand," Malcolm said to the flight attendant, his voice gaining confidence. "But I've taken care of babies with this exact problem. I know what might help." Up in first class, Hayes had reached his breaking point. His company's board meeting in Boston couldn't be rescheduled, bringing Lily had seemed the only option with his nanny sick, and now he was failing publicly and spectacularly at the one job that mattered most, being a father. "I'm so sorry," he said to no one in particular, his voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do." Harold Bennett seized the moment. "Well, that much is obvious. Some people simply aren't cut out for parenthood." He turned to the other first-class passengers. "I think we should demand the pilot make an emergency landing. This is torture." As murmurs of agreement began to rise, Malcolm Johnson reached the boundary between economy and first class, a simple blue curtain that represented a world of difference. Malcolm paused at the curtain dividing economy from first class, gathering his courage. The baby's cries had taken on a desperate quality that tugged at his heart, a sound he recognized all too well from long nights with his siblings. Taking a deep breath, he pushed aside the curtain and stepped into territory that felt as foreign as another country. The difference was immediate and stark. The wider leather seats, the crystal glasses, the hot towels, all symbols of a world Malcolm had only glimpsed in movies. But what struck him most was how the passengers looked at him, a mixture of surprise, suspicion, and in some cases, unmistakable disdain. Tiffany Carter spotted him immediately, her professional smile faltering for a split second as she assessed this unexpected development. She moved swiftly to intercept him. "Sir, I need you to return to your assigned cabin," she said quietly but firmly, positioning herself between Malcolm and the first-class passengers. Malcolm met her eyes, recognizing the complex position she was in. "Ma'am, I know this seems strange, but I think I can help with the baby. I have 4 younger siblings, and the youngest had the same crying pattern." Before Tiffany could respond, Harold Bennett's voice cut through the cabin. "What is this? Now we're letting anyone wander around the aircraft?" He looked Malcolm up and down, taking in his worn jeans and faded hoodie. "Security should be notified." Tiffany turned slightly, keeping her voice low enough that only Malcolm could hear. "Look, I understand you want to help, but this could cause problems for both of us. These passengers," she trailed off, glancing at Bennett. "I understand," Malcolm replied softly. "But that baby's been crying for hours. I think she has ear pain from the pressure changes, combined with exhaustion. I know some techniques that might work." From his seat, Jameson Hayes had noticed the exchange. 3 hours of his daughter's inconsolable crying had left him desperate enough to try anything. He stood, cradling Lily against his shoulder. "Let him through," Hayes called out, his voice hoarse from hours of attempting to soothe his daughter. Tiffany hesitated, caught between protocol and pragmatism. "Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure." "Please," Hayes interrupted. "I'm willing to try anything at this point." Malcolm moved forward cautiously, acutely aware of every eye in the cabin tracking his movement. Bennett shifted in his seat, making a show of watching his expensive watch and sighing dramatically. "This is absurd," Bennett announced to no one in particular. "Now we're taking childcare advice from random teenagers. What's next, having the janitor perform surgery?" A few passengers chuckled, others looked uncomfortable. Tiffany's posture stiffened at Bennett's comment, but she maintained her professional demeanor as she stepped aside to allow Malcolm to approach Hayes. As Malcolm came closer, Hayes noticed details he might have overlooked in less desperate circumstances: the boy's clear, intelligent eyes, his calm, confident bearing despite the obvious discomfort of the situation, the careful way he carried himself, as if trying to appear smaller and less threatening. "Hi, I'm Malcolm," the boy said, his voice gentle but steady. "I've helped with a lot of babies, including my brother who had chronic ear infections. Your daughter's cry sounds exactly like his did." Hayes studied Malcolm's face, looking for any reason to doubt or dismiss him. Instead, he found only sincere concern and quiet confidence. "I'm Jameson," he replied, the formality of introduction strangely grounding amid the chaos. "And this is Lily. She's 9 months old and usually not like this. I've tried everything I can think of." Malcolm nodded. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Lily. A moment of hesitation crossed Hayes' face. The instinctive protective response of a parent. Behind him, Bennett's voice rose again. "You can't seriously be considering handing your child to a complete stranger," Bennett said. "A teenager from economy, no less." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear to everyone present. Race, age, class, all wrapped into one dismissive judgment. Hayes looked from Bennett back to Malcolm, then down at his screaming daughter. In that moment, the tech CEO made a decision based not on prejudice or protocol, but on the universal desperation of a parent with an inconsolable child. "Yes," Hayes said firmly, turning his back on Bennett. "Please, if you think you can help her." As Hayes began to transfer Lily to Malcolm's arms, the baby's cries intensified. Malcolm didn't immediately take her, instead moving closer and speaking directly to the infant. "Hey there, Lily," he said softly, his voice taking on a melodic quality. "I hear you. That pressure in your ears hurts, doesn't it? And you're so tired you can't settle down." Hayes watched, surprised by the transformation in the teenager's demeanor. Malcolm's entire focus had shifted to Lily, as if the judgmental passengers, the social awkwardness, and the tension in the cabin had all disappeared. Tiffany observed from a discreet distance, ready to intervene if necessary but increasingly curious about the young man's approach. Other flight attendants had gathered at the galley, watching the scene unfold. As Malcolm finally took Lily into his arms, Bennett made one last attempt to assert control over the situation. "This is completely inappropriate," he announced loudly. "I'm filing a complaint with the airline. There are procedures and rules for a reason." A tense silence fell over the cabin, broken only by Lily's continued wailing. Malcolm held the baby securely, looking directly into her eyes as if they were having a conversation only they could understand. The next few moments would either vindicate Malcolm's confidence or confirm Bennett's prejudice, and potentially change the trajectory of several lives on board Flight 1459. Malcolm cradled Lily against his chest with practiced ease, his large hand supporting her tiny body with surprising gentleness. As the baby continued to wail, he began a subtle swaying motion, different from the typical rocking parents instinctively use. "Watch what happens," Malcolm said softly to Hayes, who hovered anxiously nearby. Malcolm positioned Lily so her ear pressed lightly against his chest, then started humming. It wasn't a recognizable lullaby but rather a distinctive pattern of tones that vibrated through his chest and into the baby's ear. The sound combined with his unique swaying motion, forward and back rather than side to side, created a rhythm unlike anything Hayes had tried. Within 30 seconds, Lily's desperate cries began to subside. Her tiny body, which had been rigid with distress, gradually relaxed against Malcolm's chest. Her eyelids, swollen from hours of crying, began to droop. The change was so sudden, so dramatic, that a collective gasp went through the first-class cabin. Hayes stared in disbelief, his mouth slightly open. "How did you?" he began, then fell silent as Malcolm continued humming, his eyes focused entirely on Lily. The transformation wasn't just in the baby. Malcolm's entire demeanor had shifted. The cautious, self-conscious teenager who had carefully navigated his way through first class had been replaced by someone entirely comfortable and confident in his abilities. Have you ever witnessed someone find their element, that special zone where their unique gifts shine through? Comment, number 1, if you've ever seen someone transform when they're doing what they were born to do. Hit that like button if you believe everyone has special talents that often go unrecognized. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about unexpected heroes and hidden talents. And what do you think will happen next? Will Hayes learn something important from this young man, or will prejudice win out? Let me know in the comments below as we continue this incredible true story. As Malcolm continued to work his magic with Lily, the cabin remained eerily quiet, as if everyone was afraid that speaking might break the spell. Hayes moved closer, studying Malcolm's technique with the intensity he usually reserved for analyzing new technologies. It's a specific frequency, Malcolm explained softly, still swaying. The humming vibrates through my chest and helps equalize the pressure in her ears. The motion mimics the vestibular stimulation she'd get in the womb. Babies this age still respond to those sensations. Hayes nodded, absorbing this information. Where did you learn this? Malcolm's eyes flickered briefly with a memory. My youngest brother, DeAndre. He had chronic ear infections when he was a baby. My mom works 2 jobs, so I was often the one up with him at night. His hands gently repositioned Lily as her breathing deepened. I tried everything, then started experimenting with different sounds and movements. This combination worked like magic. As Malcolm spoke, Hayes noticed details he'd been too stressed to register earlier: the worn edges of Malcolm's hoodie, the scuffed but meticulously clean sneakers, the watch that was at least a decade old. Everything about the boy spoke of careful maintenance of limited resources. Harold Bennett, however, remained unmoved by the miracle unfolding before him. Well, isn't that special, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. The boy has a knack for babysitting. Perhaps we should give him a cookie. Tiffany, who had been watching from nearby, stepped forward. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. As you can see, the baby is finally settling down. Bennett scoffed. I'm simply pointing out that while this little display is touching, it doesn't excuse the disruption of our entire flight. Some of us have important business waiting in Boston. Hayes turned toward Bennett, a flash of anger crossing his face, but before he could speak, another passenger, a middle-aged black woman in a business suit, intervened. Some would say that comforting a distressed child is important business too, sir, she said calmly. Perhaps the most important. Bennett's face reddened. I wasn't speaking to you. Yet I heard you all the same, she replied coolly, then turned to Malcolm with a warm smile. You have a gift, young man. Malcolm nodded in appreciation but kept his focus on Lily, who had now fallen into a peaceful sleep against his chest. The cabin had transformed from a scene of chaos to one of near tranquility. Hayes watched his daughter's peaceful face, emotion welling in his throat. For 9 months since Catherine's death, he had struggled to connect with Lily, to understand her needs, to be the father she deserved. And here was this teenager, with no fancy education or resources, demonstrating a level of intuitive understanding that humbled him completely. Would you mind telling me more about yourself, Malcolm? Hayes asked quietly. What brings you on this flight? Malcolm hesitated, then spoke softly to avoid disturbing Lily. I'm heading to Boston for an audition. Berklee College of Music has a scholarship program. It's a long shot, but my saxophone teacher thought I should try. Hayes raised his eyebrows. You're a musician? Yes, sir. Since I was 6. Started with my grandfather's old saxophone, took to it natural-like. A hint of pride crept into Malcolm's voice, quickly tempered with practicality. The scholarship's the only way I could ever afford it, though. Tuition's more than my mom makes in a year. As Malcolm spoke, his story began to emerge in fragments. How his father had left when he was 8. How his mother worked as a nurse's aide by day and cleaned offices at night. How he'd become the primary caretaker for his siblings while maintaining honor roll grades and pursuing his music. The other first-class passengers listened with varying reactions. Some seemed genuinely moved, others uncomfortable, as if Malcolm's reality was an unwelcome intrusion into the privileged bubble of first class. Bennett, however, made a show of putting on his noise-canceling headphones and turning away. Tiffany returned with a glass of water for Malcolm, her eyes conveying silent support. "That's really impressive," she said. "Both your music and what you did for this little one." Hayes nodded in agreement, watching his peacefully sleeping daughter. "Would you like to sit down?" he offered, gesturing to the empty seat beside his. "Unless you need to return to your original seat." Malcolm glanced back toward economy class, then at Lily in his arms. "I probably should head back soon, but," he looked down at the sleeping baby. "Maybe just until you're sure she's settled." Hayes smiled, his first genuine smile in hours. "Please, I insist." As Malcolm carefully sat down, still cradling Lily, a shift seemed to occur in the cabin's atmosphere. The invisible barrier between worlds, temporarily breached by a crying baby, had revealed something profound about humanity, privilege, and the arbitrary nature of the boundaries society creates. As Malcolm settled into the first-class seat beside Hayes, Lily continued to sleep peacefully against his chest. The leather seat enveloped him in a comfort he'd never experienced on a plane before, making the cramped economy seat he'd occupied for hours seem like a distant memory. Still, he remained perched slightly forward, as if not quite believing he belonged there. "So you mentioned a specific humming pattern," Hayes said, his analytical mind seeking to understand the technique. "Can you explain how it works?" Malcolm nodded, keeping his voice low. "It's all about frequency and resonance. Babies respond to certain sound patterns that remind them of the womb, the mother's heartbeat, blood flow, muffled voice. I discovered that humming at a specific pitch while letting it vibrate through my chest creates a similar effect." He demonstrated, producing a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate at a frequency just below ordinary conversation. "The trick is matching the pattern to what the baby needs. Lily's crying told me she was dealing with ear pressure and exhaustion, so I used a lower frequency with a slight pulse to it." Hayes listened with fascination. "That's remarkable. And you figured this out just by trial and error?" "Mostly," Malcolm replied. "When my brother DeAndre was colicky, I tried everything. One night when I was practicing my saxophone very softly, I noticed he stopped crying when I played certain notes. That's when I started experimenting with different sounds and eventually realized I could reproduce the effect with just my voice." Tiffany approached with a fresh bottle of water for Malcolm, smiling as she observed Lily's peaceful slumber. "You've worked a miracle here," she said. "I've never seen a baby calm down so quickly after crying that long." Malcolm accepted the water gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am." "Please, call me Tiffany," she replied, then turned to Hayes. "Would you like anything, Mr. Hayes?" "Jameson, please," he corrected. "And I'm fine for now, thank you." As Tiffany moved away, Hayes turned back to Malcolm. "You mentioned Berklee College of Music. What do you play?" "Saxophone is my main instrument," Malcolm answered, a flash of passion lighting his eyes. "Alto, tenor, and soprano. But I also play piano and a little guitar." "The auditions for their jazz performance program. And when is this audition?" "Tomorrow morning at 9, Malcolm said. "I've been preparing for months. My high school band director helped me record the pre-screening videos, and I still can't believe I made it to the live auditions." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite an achievement. The competition must be fierce." "Global," Malcolm confirmed. "Thousands apply for maybe 20 full scholarships." "And if you don't get the scholarship?" Hayes asked carefully. Malcolm's expression shifted subtly, a practiced mask of acceptance sliding into place. "Community college back home, I guess. Keep working, saving up. Try again next year if I can." The matter-of-fact way he stated this, without self-pity or drama, struck Hayes. This was clearly a young man accustomed to facing limitations with dignity. "What about your family?" Hayes inquired. "You mentioned siblings." Malcolm's face softened. 4 of them. I'm the oldest. DeAndre's the baby, he's 3 now. Then there's Zoe who's 5, Michael who's 9, and Aaliyah who's 14. He shifted Lily slightly as she stirred, immediately adapting his posture to maintain her comfort. My mom does her best, but since my dad left, it's been tough. She works all the time. And you help take care of them, Hayes stated rather than asked, watching Malcolm's natural caregiving abilities. Someone has to, Malcolm replied simply. My mom deserves a break sometimes, you know. And the little ones, they didn't ask for any of this. From across the aisle, Harold Bennett made a sound of derision. Though he pretended to be engrossed in his tablet, he had clearly been listening to the conversation. Touching story, Bennett remarked sarcastically. Single mother, absent father, struggling against the odds. We've all heard it before. The cabin tensed at his words. Tiffany, who was passing by with a tray, paused, her knuckles widening around the handles. Hayes turned toward Bennett, his expression hardening. Excuse me. Bennett looked up, seemingly pleased to have provoked a reaction. Oh, I'm just commenting on how predictable this little narrative is. Boy from the wrong side of the tracks dreams of making it big. Very Hollywood. Malcolm's face remained impassive, though Hayes noticed how he drew Lily a fraction closer, as if shielding her from Bennett's toxicity. Mr. Bennett, Tiffany interjected with forced professionalism, can I get you anything else? Yes, you can tell me why this boy is still sitting in first class when his ticket is clearly for economy, Bennett replied, not bothering to look at her. Or do the rules not apply anymore? Hayes had had enough. He's sitting here as my guest, Bennett. And he's done more to improve this flight in 5 minutes than you have with your complaints over the past 3 hours. Bennett's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Hayes. Your company's stock has been volatile lately, hasn't it? I believe my investment firm holds quite a significant position. The threat was thinly veiled, but before Hayes could respond, Malcolm began to stand, carefully supporting Lily's sleeping form. It's okay, he said quietly to Hayes. I should probably head back to my seat anyway. Don't want to cause any trouble. The dignity in the boy's response. His willingness to remove himself from a situation where he was being targeted, rather than escalated, struck Hayes forcefully. Here was a teenager showing more maturity than a 60-something business executive. Malcolm, please stay, Hayes said firmly. Mr. Bennett doesn't speak for me or, I suspect, for most people on this plane. The other passengers were now openly watching the exchange. The black businesswoman who had spoken earlier nodded in agreement with Hayes. Indeed he doesn't, she confirmed. I find your insights on music and your care for children far more valuable than certain opinions being expressed. Bennett scoffed. This is absurd. The boy clearly has you all fooled with this act. Act? Tiffany questioned, unable to maintain her professional detachment any longer. The baby who screamed for 3 hours straight is now sound asleep. That's not an act, sir. That's a skill many parents would pay good money for. As if to emphasize the point, Lily stirred slightly in Malcolm's arms, made a small sound, then settled back to sleep as Malcolm automatically resumed his gentle swaying motion. Hayes watched this with a sudden realization. You know, he said to Malcolm, I've been trying to hire a nanny since my wife passed. I've gone through 3 agencies and countless interviews, and no one has shown the kind of natural ability you just demonstrated. Malcolm looked surprised. Really? I just do what comes naturally with my siblings. That's exactly it, Hayes replied. It can't be taught. You either have it or you don't. He paused, considering something. Have you ever thought about childcare as a profession? At least until your music career takes off. Bennett let out a derisive laugh. Now you're offering him a job. This gets better by the minute. But Hayes wasn't listening to Bennett anymore. He was watching Malcolm's face, seeing the thoughtful consideration there. I hadn't really thought about it that way before, Malcolm admitted. I just always took care of my brothers and sisters because they needed me. Hayes nodded. Sometimes our greatest talents are the things that come so naturally to us that we don't even recognize them as special. As the conversation continued, something was shifting in the first-class cabin. The artificial boundaries of class and race that had seemed so rigid were beginning to dissolve in the face of human connection. Most passengers were now openly engaged, some even offering Malcolm words of encouragement about his upcoming audition. Bennett, increasingly isolated in his hostility, fumed silently, his presence like a dark cloud unable to disperse the growing warmth of the moment. And throughout it all, baby Lily slept peacefully, blissfully unaware that her cries had inadvertently created a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected. As the flight progressed into its fourth hour, a fragile harmony had settled over the first-class cabin. Malcolm remained beside Hayes, Lily still sleeping contentedly in his arms. Their conversation had deepened, moving from Malcolm's techniques with babies to his passion for music, his family life, and his hopes for the future. Several other passengers had joined the discussion, asking Malcolm about his upcoming audition and offering encouragement. Even the flight attendants paused occasionally to contribute to the conversation, creating an unusual sense of community rarely experienced in the stratified environment of commercial air travel. Only Harold Bennett remained apart from this growing camaraderie, his displeasure evident in his rigid posture and occasional scoffs. Each time the conversation around him grew warmer, his expression darkened further. Finally, as Malcolm was describing a particularly challenging saxophone piece he planned to play at his audition, Bennett slammed his tablet down on his tray table. "Enough of this charade," he announced loudly. "This has gone on far too long. The boy should return to his assigned seat in economy where he belongs." The abruptness of his outburst created an immediate silence. Malcolm froze mid-sentence, his arms instinctively tightening protectively around Lily. Tiffany, who had been refreshing drinks nearby, stepped forward. "Sir, please lower your voice. The baby is still sleeping." Bennett ignored her, focusing his attention on Hayes. "You're encouraging this boundary crossing. There are rules and procedures on aircraft for good reason." Hayes turned to face Bennett directly, his voice measured but firm. "Malcolm was kind enough to help when my daughter was in distress. He's sitting here as my guest because I invited him to. I don't see the problem." "The problem," Bennett retorted, "is that actions have consequences. When you allow people to disregard established boundaries, you invite chaos." He gestured dismissively toward Malcolm. "Next thing you know, everyone from economy will be wandering up here expecting free champagne." The racial undertones in Bennett's comments hung in the air, unmistakable to everyone present. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tiffany's professional smile had vanished completely, replaced by a tightly controlled expression that barely concealed her anger. Malcolm began to stand, carefully supporting Lily's sleeping form. "I should go back to my seat," he said quietly. "I don't want to cause any trouble." Hayes found himself at a crossroads. The path of least resistance would be to let Malcolm return to economy class. The conflict would dissipate, Bennett would be satisfied, and the remaining hours of the flight would pass without incident. It was the pragmatic choice, the business decision: minimize disruption, avoid confrontation. But as Hayes looked at Malcolm, this remarkable young man who had shown such kindness, such talent, such dignity in the face of prejudice, something shifted inside him. A memory surfaced: Catherine, his late wife, confronting a board member who had made a dismissive comment about their female engineers. "If we don't stand for something," she had said, "then we stand for nothing." In that moment, Hayes realized how much of Catherine's moral courage he had lost since her death. He had retreated into his grief and his work, focusing on Lily's physical needs but neglecting the example he needed to set for her as she grew. "No, Malcolm," Hayes said firmly, rising to his feet. "You've done nothing wrong. Please stay." Bennett scoffed. "This is ridiculous." The boy clearly manipulated the situation to gain access to first class. And you fell for it completely. Manipulated? Hayes repeated incredulously. By soothing my child when no one else could. By sharing his knowledge and experience freely, asking nothing in return. Oh, please, Bennett sneered. He's obviously angling for something. A job, connections, money. They always are. The cabin went deadly silent at Bennett's words. The pronoun hung in the air, its implication crystal clear. Tiffany stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Mr. Bennett, I need to ask you to refrain from making such comments. They could be considered discriminatory. Bennett turned his cold gaze on her. I don't recall asking for your opinion. Why don't you stick to serving drinks? It's what you're paid for, after all. Tiffany flinched as if she'd been slapped, but maintained her composure. Sir, as a representative of this airline, it's my responsibility to ensure all passengers are treated with respect. Respect is earned, Bennett retorted. And I've yet to see evidence that either of you deserve it. Malcolm, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, carefully transferred Lily back to Hayes. The baby stirred but didn't wake, testament to how deeply settled she was after Malcolm's intervention. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Hayes, Malcolm said quietly. But I think it's best if I go back now. As Malcolm prepared to leave, Hayes felt something break inside him, the last remnants of the corporate shell he had built around himself since Catherine's death. The man who had focused solely on stock prices and board meetings, who had buried his grief in work, suddenly found his voice. No, Hayes said, loud enough that several rows of passengers turned to look. No, this stops now. He turned to face Bennett directly. You've sat there for hours, making snide comments and barely disguised racist remarks. You've belittled a young man who showed more compassion and skill than most adults I know. You've disrespected a flight attendant who has been nothing but professional despite your behavior. Bennett's face reddened. How dare you? I'm not finished, Hayes continued, his voice gaining strength. My wife, Catherine, died bringing our daughter into this world. Her last coherent words to me were to raise Lily to be kind and to stand up against injustice when she sees it. For the past 9 months, I've been so lost in grief that I've forgotten that promise. But not anymore. The cabin was utterly silent now, every passenger and crew member transfixed by the confrontation. Malcolm didn't come to first class looking for handouts or special treatment, Hayes continued. He came because he saw someone in distress, my daughter, and knew he could help. That's the kind of character that deserves recognition, not contempt. Bennett's expression was thunderous. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Hayes. My influence. Your influence means nothing to me, Hayes interrupted. Threaten my company all you want. Some things are more important than business. Just then, Lily began to stir in Hayes' arms, making small sounds of distress. Without hesitation, Malcolm stepped forward, showing Hayes how to adjust his hold. Like this, he said softly, demonstrating the proper position. Support her head at this angle. Hayes followed Malcolm's guidance, and Lily settled back into sleep. The simple interaction spoke volumes, a wordless demonstration of what truly mattered. Bennett, increasingly isolated as other passengers openly sided with Hayes and Malcolm, made one last desperate attempt to reassert control. This is outrageous, he sputtered, half rising from his seat. I'll have both your jobs for this, he added, glaring at Tiffany and another flight attendant who had joined her. Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately, the second flight attendant said firmly. Bennett ignored her, turning his attention to Malcolm. And you? Don't think this little performance will get you anywhere. People like you need to learn their place. The naked prejudice in his statement sent a shock wave through the cabin. Several passengers gasped audibly. One man 2 rows back stood up, his face flushed with anger. That's enough, the man said. I've been listening to your racist comments for too long without speaking up. I'm ashamed of myself for that, and I won't be silent anymore. Bennett looked around, suddenly realizing he had no allies in his position. His face contorted with rage as he jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. "You think you're special? You think your sob story and your little baby tricks make you belong here? You're nothing but a..." Before Bennett could finish his sentence, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking," a stern voice announced. "I've been informed of a disturbance in the first-class cabin. I want to remind everyone that abusive or discriminatory language will not be tolerated on this aircraft. We will make an unscheduled landing if this behavior continues, and the responsible parties will be removed and potentially face charges." The implicit threat hung in the air as Bennett slowly sank back into his seat, his face a mask of impotent rage. In the sudden silence that followed, Hayes looked at Malcolm, seeing not a teenager from economy class, but a young man of exceptional character facing prejudice with dignity far beyond his years. "I'm sorry," Hayes said quietly, the words meant for Malcolm but audible to those nearby. "I'm sorry you had to experience that." Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "It's not the first time, Mr. Hayes. Probably won't be the last." The simple truth of that statement hit Hayes with unexpected force. This moment would pass, the flight would end, but Malcolm would continue to face such prejudice throughout his life. Regardless of his talent, his character, or his achievements. That realization solidified something in Hayes' mind, a decision that would alter multiple lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The aftermath of the confrontation left the first-class cabin in a strange limbo. Bennett had retreated into stony silence, his defeat palpable as he kept his gaze fixed on his tablet screen, pointedly ignoring everyone around him. The other passengers alternated between hushed conversations and curious glances toward Hayes and Malcolm, who remained seated side by side, Lily still sleeping peacefully between them. Tiffany moved through the cabin with renewed confidence, her earlier forced smile replaced by a genuine one as passengers treated her with newfound respect. Several had quietly apologized for not speaking up sooner against Bennett's behavior. "Can I get either of you anything?" she asked, stopping beside Hayes and Malcolm. "I'm fine, thank you," Malcolm replied politely. Hayes nodded in agreement, then paused. "Actually, Tiffany, would you mind taking a photo of us? My phone's in my jacket pocket." As Tiffany retrieved the phone, Hayes turned to Malcolm. "If that's okay with you. I'd like to remember this moment." Malcolm looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, that's fine." Tiffany positioned the phone, capturing an image of the unlikely trio, the billionaire tech CEO, the teenager from South Chicago, and the sleeping infant between them. The photo would later become significant in ways none of them could have anticipated. After returning the phone, Tiffany leaned closer to Hayes. "The captain would like a word when you have a moment. Nothing to worry about, he just wants to make sure everything's settled down." Hayes nodded. "Of course." As Tiffany moved away, Hayes turned back to Malcolm. "You know, I never properly thanked you for what you did for Lily." Malcolm shrugged slightly. "Anyone would have helped if they knew how." "No," Hayes countered gently. "They wouldn't have. Most people would have stayed in their assigned seat, complained about the noise, or expected something in return for helping." He paused, studying the young man's face. "You crossed boundaries that most people wouldn't, risked rejection and embarrassment, all to help a baby you didn't know." Malcolm seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "It just seemed like the right thing to do." "That's exactly my point," Hayes said. "The right thing isn't always the easy thing. Sometimes it requires courage." He glanced toward Bennett, then back at Malcolm. "Like the courage to maintain your dignity in the face of prejudice." Malcolm followed his gaze briefly, then looked down at Lily. "My grandfather used to say that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. I try to remember that." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was," Malcolm replied, a hint of sadness in his voice. "He's the one who got me started with music. Used to play saxophone in jazz clubs in Chicago back in the day. His old Selmer was my first horn." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Is that the same instrument you'll be playing at your audition? No, sir. That one's, well, it's seen better days. The school raised money for the one I use now. It's not top of the line, but it's good enough. Something in Malcolm's tone, the careful management of expectations, the pragmatic acceptance of limitations, struck Hayes forcefully. It was the voice of someone who had learned early that certain dreams required compromise. Before Hayes could respond, Lily began to stir in Malcolm's arms. Her small face scrunched up as she opened her eyes, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar person holding her. For a tense second, Hayes braced himself for another crying episode. Instead, Lily looked up at Malcolm with curious eyes, reached one tiny hand toward his face, and made a soft cooing sound. Malcolm smiled. "Well, hello there," he said gently. "Had a good nap, did you?" The baby responded with a delighted gurgle, patting Malcolm's cheek with her small palm. Hayes watched in amazement. In the 9 months since Catherine's death, he had struggled to connect with his daughter, to understand her needs, to be the father she deserved. He had hired experts and read books, yet this teenager from South Chicago had an instinctive understanding that no amount of money could buy. "She likes you," Hayes observed, his voice thick with emotion. "Babies are good judges of character," Tiffany remarked as she passed by with a fresh bottle. "They haven't learned prejudice yet." Her comment, though simple, carried weight in the wake of what had transpired. Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement, including the black businesswoman who had stood up to Bennett earlier. "That's the truest thing I've heard all day," the woman said. "We aren't born with bias, we learn it." She looked pointedly at Bennett, who continued to ignore everyone. As Lily became more alert, Malcolm showed Hayes how to hold her in a position that would keep her ears comfortable as the plane began its gradual descent toward Boston. "The pressure changes during landing can be even harder on their ears," Malcolm explained. "This position helps keep the eustachian tubes open. And if she starts to fuss, try this gentle massage behind the ear." He demonstrated the technique on his own ear. Hayes watched attentively, determined to learn. "You'd make an excellent teacher, you know." Malcolm smiled slightly. "My mom says the same thing. Says I have patience." "She's right," Hayes agreed. "Have you ever considered teaching music someday? After Berkeley?" "If I get in," Malcolm qualified automatically, that careful management of expectations resurfacing. "When you get in," Hayes corrected. "Talent like yours doesn't go unrecognized." Malcolm seemed about to respond with his usual pragmatism but paused, allowing himself a moment of hopeful consideration. "Maybe someday. I'd like to perform first, see where that takes me. But yeah, I could see myself teaching eventually." As they continued talking, Hayes found himself increasingly impressed by Malcolm's maturity, his clear-eyed view of both challenges and possibilities. Despite financial hardship and family responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults, let alone teenagers, Malcolm had maintained his grades, nurtured his musical talent, and developed a remarkable capacity for compassion. Across the aisle, Bennett finally closed his tablet and signaled for Tiffany. When she approached, his demeanor had shifted from outright hostility to cold formality. "I'd like to be moved to another seat," he stated flatly. Tiffany maintained her professional composure. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're at full capacity in first class. Perhaps I could offer you a complimentary beverage instead." Bennett's jaw tightened. "This is unacceptable. I've been a Diamond status member for 15 years. "I understand, sir," Tiffany replied evenly. "However, the captain has requested that all passengers remain in their assigned seats as we begin our descent into Boston." As if on cue, the seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft chime. Bennett was forced to accept defeat once more, his expression darkening as he fastened his seatbelt with unnecessary force. Hayes turned back to Malcolm, lowering his voice. "When we land, I'd like to talk to you about something important. An idea I have." Malcolm looked curious but nodded. "Sure, Mr. Hayes." "Jameson, please," Hayes corrected. I think we're well past formalities at this point. For the remainder of the descent, Hayes found himself contemplating the strange sequence of events that had led to this moment. His wife's death, his daughter's inconsolable crying, a young man's compassionate intervention, and a prejudiced businessman's hostility, all converging to create a crossroads in multiple lives. As the plane banked gently over Boston Harbor, Hayes made a silent promise to Catherine, wherever she was, he would honor her memory not just by caring for their daughter, but by living the values she had embodied: courage, compassion, and a willingness to stand against injustice. The transformation had begun, not just for Hayes but for everyone who had witnessed the unfolding drama at 35,000 feet. And as the wheels of Flight 1459 touched down on the runway, a new chapter was about to begin. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and checking phones. The first-class cabin, however, maintained an unusual stillness. The events that had unfolded over the past few hours had created a sense of connection that no one seemed eager to break. Hayes gently took Lily from Malcolm, settling her into the baby carrier he'd extracted from his carry-on. The infant remained calm, occasionally glancing toward Malcolm as if checking that he was still nearby. She really has taken to you, Hayes observed, securing the final strap on the carrier. Malcolm smiled. She's a good baby. Just needed some understanding. Bennett was the first to stand when the seatbelt sign turned off, gathering his belongings with efficient movements, clearly eager to distance himself from the situation. He avoided eye contact with everyone, his earlier bluster replaced by cold detachment. As he moved toward the exit, Tiffany stepped into his path. Mr. Bennett, the captain would like a word with you before you deplane, she said, her tone professional but firm. Bennett's face tightened. I have a car waiting and a meeting to attend. I understand, sir, but this will only take a moment. If you'll follow me, please. With visible reluctance, Bennett followed Tiffany toward the front of the aircraft, disappearing into the galley area. Hayes turned to Malcolm. I meant what I said about wanting to talk. Do you have time before your audition tomorrow? Malcolm checked his watch, the same worn timepiece Hayes had noticed earlier. My audition's at 9, and I need to practice tonight. But I'm free after that. Perfect, Hayes replied, reaching into his jacket for a business card. My number's on here. Text me when you're done, and we can meet somewhere near Berkeley. Malcolm accepted the card with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Can I ask what this is about? Hayes adjusted Lily in her carrier as he considered his response. Let's just say that today has been clarifying for me. In more ways than one. Before Malcolm could inquire further, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Boston Logan International. Local time is 5:42 p.m., and the temperature is 62 degrees. I want to personally thank you for flying with us today, especially those who demonstrated patience and kindness during our journey. There was a brief pause before he continued. I'd also like to inform you that Mr. Harold Bennett will be escorted from the aircraft by airport security for further questioning regarding his disruptive behavior. The rest of you are free to deplane at your convenience. Thank you for choosing United Airlines. A murmur went through the cabin at this announcement. Bennett's fate had been decided, it seemed, during his private conversation with the captain. Malcolm looked concerned. Will he be arrested? Probably not, Hayes replied. More likely he'll receive a formal warning and possibly be banned from the airline for a period of time. Actions have consequences, as he was so fond of pointing out. As the first-class passengers began to deplane, several stopped to speak to Malcolm. The black businesswoman clasped his hand firmly. Young man, you showed extraordinary grace today. Your parents must be very proud. Thank you, ma'am, Malcolm replied, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Another passenger, an older white man with kind eyes, pressed a business card into Malcolm's hand. I'm on the board at New England Conservatory. If Berkeley doesn't work out, though I suspect it will, give me a call. Talent like yours deserves to be nurtured. By the time they reached the jet bridge, Malcolm had collected several business cards and well wishes. Tiffany stopped him at the aircraft door. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed much more. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to go far in life." Malcolm nodded, suddenly finding himself without words. The day's events. From his courageous decision to help a crying baby to the confrontation with Bennett to this unexpected outpouring of support, had left him emotionally exhausted. In the terminal, Hayes adjusted Lily's carrier and turned to Malcolm. "Where are you staying tonight?" "The admissions office arranged a hostel," Malcolm replied. "It's about 20 minutes from campus by subway." Hayes frowned slightly. "The night before your audition. You need proper rest." Malcolm shrugged. "It's fine. I've slept in worse places." The matter-of-fact way he said this, without complaint or self-pity, strengthened Hayes' resolve about the idea that had been forming in his mind. "Listen," Hayes said, "I have a suite at the Four Seasons. There's a separate bedroom you could use, with privacy to practice. It would be much quieter than a hostel dormitory, and you'd be just a short walk from Berkeley tomorrow morning." Malcolm looked startled by the offer. "That's really generous, but I couldn't impose like that." "It's not an imposition," Hayes assured him. "After what you did for Lily, for both of us, it's the least I can offer. Besides, I'd value the company." This last part was unexpectedly true. The prospect of another evening alone in a hotel suite, trying to manage Lily while wrestling with grief and work obligations, had been weighing on Hayes. Malcolm's presence would be a welcome change. Malcolm hesitated, clearly torn between practical needs and the ingrained caution about accepting help that many who have struggled financially develop. "Tell you what," Hayes offered, sensing his conflict. "Think of it as a fair exchange. You get a quiet place to sleep and practice, and in return, you can show me some more of your techniques for soothing Lily." Put that way, as an exchange of value rather than charity, Malcolm seemed more comfortable with the idea. "I guess that would be okay. I should call my mom first, though. Let her know where I'm staying." Hayes nodded, respecting the young man's responsibility to his family. "Of course. My driver is waiting outside. We can head there whenever you're ready." As they walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, Hayes found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, he had been dreading this trip to Boston, the board meeting, the difficulty of traveling with Lily, the constant reminder of Catherine's absence. Now, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Malcolm retrieved his worn duffel bag and carefully handled saxophone case from the baggage carousel. The contrast between his meager belongings and Hayes' expensive luggage was stark, yet another reminder of the arbitrary nature of privilege. Outside, Hayes' driver waited beside a black Escalade. As they settled into the spacious vehicle, Malcolm looked around with undisguised appreciation. "Nice ride," he commented, carefully placing his saxophone case on the seat beside him. Hayes smiled. "One of the perks of the job." As the car pulled away from the curb, Hayes found himself studying Malcolm's profile. There was something about this young man that reminded him of himself at that age, the determination, the willingness to work hard, the quiet ambition. The difference was that Hayes had grown up with every advantage: wealthy parents, private schools, Ivy League connections. His path had been cleared before he took his first step. Malcolm, by contrast, faced obstacles at every turn. Yet here he was, on the verge of a prestigious audition, his talent and character undeniable despite the constraints of his circumstances. The realization solidified the decision Hayes had been contemplating since their conversation on the plane. As they traveled through Boston toward the Four Seasons, he began to formulate the proposal he would make to Malcolm after his audition tomorrow. A proposal that would change both their lives in ways neither could fully anticipate. Lily cooed softly from her carrier, reaching a tiny hand toward Malcolm across the car's interior. "I think she misses you already," Hayes observed. Malcolm smiled, gently taking the baby's hand. "She's a smart one. You're going to have your hands full when she starts walking." "I'm counting on it," Hayes replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. For the first time since Catherine's death, Hayes found himself looking toward the future with something approaching hope. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: a baby's cry on an airplane had set in motion events that would resonate far beyond this day. And as the Boston skyline came into view, backlit by the setting sun, both Hayes and Malcolm sensed that they stood at the threshold of something new and unexpected, a connection forged in the crucible of confrontation, now opening into possibility. 3 months later, the prestigious Jordan Hall at the New England Conservatory of Music was filled to capacity. The audience, a mix of students, faculty, and Boston's cultural elite, sat in hushed anticipation as the house lights dimmed. In the front row, Jameson Hayes adjusted Lily on his lap. At 1 year old, she was more alert and active now, but she settled contentedly against her father's chest, her eyes fixed on the stage as if sensing the importance of the moment. Beside them sat Tanya Johnson, a woman in her early 40s wearing a simple but elegant dress, a far cry from the scrubs and uniform she typically wore for her jobs as a nurse's aide and office cleaner. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears of pride as she gripped Hayes' free hand tightly. "I still can't believe this is happening," she whispered. Hayes smiled warmly. "Believe it. Your son earned every bit of this." On stage, a distinguished-looking professor stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce the winner of this year's Young Jazz Innovators Award, performing his original composition, Flight 1459. Please welcome Malcolm Johnson." The applause was enthusiastic as Malcolm walked onto the stage, saxophone in hand. He wore a tailored suit, simple but perfectly fitted, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. His eyes found his mother in the front row, then moved to Hayes and Lily, a smile of gratitude briefly crossing his face before he composed himself for the performance. The journey to this moment had begun in the Four Seasons hotel room the night after their fateful flight. Malcolm had practiced diligently for his Berkeley audition while Hayes worked nearby, occasionally offering encouragement or asking questions about Malcolm's music. The next morning, Malcolm had performed brilliantly at his audition, impressing the faculty with both his technical skill and emotional depth. When he returned to the hotel afterward, Hayes had been waiting with a proposal. "I've been thinking about what happened on that plane," Hayes had said. "About privilege, opportunity, and barriers. About talent being universal but access being limited." Malcolm had listened attentively as Hayes outlined his idea, a new foundation, funded initially by Hayes personally but designed to become self-sustaining, focused on identifying talented young musicians from underserved communities and providing them with not just financial support, but mentorship, networking, and practical assistance. "I want you to be the first recipient," Hayes had explained. "Full tuition at Berkeley, housing, living expenses, instrument costs, whatever you need to focus entirely on your music." Malcolm's initial reaction had been exactly what Hayes expected: polite refusal. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Hayes had countered. "It's investment. And there are conditions." Those conditions had included Malcolm helping to design the foundation structure and selection process, ensuring it addressed the real barriers he had faced. Hayes had also proposed that Malcolm work part-time as Lily's music teacher and occasional caregiver, utilizing his natural abilities while earning additional income. "This isn't a handout," Hayes had insisted. "It's a recognition of your exceptional talent and character. And it's what Catherine would have wanted." After consulting with his mother and much consideration, Malcolm had accepted. The Hayes Foundation for Musical Excellence was established shortly thereafter, with an initial endowment of $10 million and a commitment to supporting 5 new students each year. Now, as Malcolm raised his saxophone to begin his performance, the fruits of that decision were evident to everyone present. The composition started softly, a gentle melody reminiscent of a lullaby, before building in complexity and emotional intensity. Those who knew the story recognized the narrative elements, the chaos and tension of the first section representing the crying baby and strained atmosphere of the plane, the introduction of a soothing countermelody symbolizing Malcolm's intervention, the harsh, discordant notes reflecting Bennett's prejudice, and finally, the triumphant, hopeful resolution as barriers dissolved and connection was established. Hayes watched with immense pride as Malcolm commanded the stage, his playing so assured and expressive that several audience members were moved to tears. Lily, despite her young age, remained transfixed by the performance, occasionally swaying in rhythm to the music. Tanya Johnson wiped away tears as her son's music filled the prestigious hall. "He always had something special," she whispered. "I just never thought others would get to hear it." "The world needs to hear it," Hayes replied softly. "And now they will." As the piece built toward its finale, Hayes reflected on the transformation that had occurred in his own life since that flight. The grief of losing Catherine would never fully disappear, but it had been tempered by a renewed sense of purpose. The Hayes Foundation had quickly grown beyond its initial concept, now addressing systemic barriers in music education more broadly. More personally, Hayes had found in Malcolm not just a musical mentor for Lily, but a friend whose perspective constantly challenged and expanded his own worldview. Their unlikely connection had led to others. Hayes had helped Tanya secure a nursing scholarship to complete her RN degree, reducing her workload from 3 jobs to 1. Malcolm's siblings now had access to educational resources previously beyond their reach, and Hayes himself had become a vocal advocate for equity initiatives within the tech industry. As Malcolm played the final notes of his composition, the audience erupted in a standing ovation. Hayes stood with Lily in his arms, clapping enthusiastically as Malcolm took a modest bow. Afterward, at the reception, Harold Bennett was the last person anyone expected to see. Yet there he stood, looking somewhat diminished compared to his imposing presence on the plane, approaching Malcolm with visible discomfort. "Mr. Johnson," Bennett said stiffly. "I owe you an apology." Malcolm regarded him with surprise but no hostility. "That's unexpected." "Yes, well." Bennett cleared his throat. "After our encounter, I was required to attend diversity training as a condition of maintaining my status with the airline. I found it illuminating." Hayes, who had approached protectively, watched the exchange with interest. "I behaved abominably," Bennett continued. "My prejudice blinded me to your character and talent. Today's performance made that painfully clear." Malcolm nodded, accepting the apology with grace beyond his years. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Bennett. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Bennett nodded awkwardly, then turned to Hayes. "Your foundation is doing important work. My firm would like to discuss a potential partnership." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "We can talk. Though I should warn you, Malcolm sits on our board and has veto power over all partnerships." Bennett actually smiled slightly at this. As he should. "Good evening, gentlemen." With that, he departed, leaving Hayes and Malcolm looking at each other in mild disbelief. "Did that just happen?" Malcolm asked. Hayes shook his head wonderingly. Apparently even the Bennetts of the world can change, given enough incentive. Tiffany Carter, who had been invited to the performance as Hayes' guest, joined them. She had recently been promoted to Senior Cabin Services Manager, a position she attributed partly to standing her ground during the incident with Bennett. "Miracles never cease," she commented, having overheard the exchange. "Though I wouldn't trust his conversion completely just yet." "Trust but verify," Hayes agreed. "Speaking of which, how's the new diversity initiative at United going?" Tiffany smiled proudly. "The program launches next month. First of its kind in the industry." Their conversation was interrupted as Tanya approached with Lily, who immediately reached for Malcolm. The baby, now toddling and beginning to form words, had maintained her special bond with him, brightening visibly whenever he arrived for their twice-weekly music sessions. "Mama," she exclaimed happily, her name for Malcolm that neither adult had the heart to correct. Malcolm took her with practiced ease, his expression softening as it always did around children. "Hey there, Miss Lily. Did you like the music?" Lily patted his face in response, then made a humming sound reminiscent of the melody he had played. "She's got a good ear," Malcolm observed. "Takes after her mother, I bet." Hayes nodded, a flash of bittersweet memory crossing his face. "Catherine loved music. She would have adored you, Malcolm." The reception continued around them, with faculty and patrons approaching to congratulate Malcolm on his performance and scholarship. Through it all, he maintained the same humble gratitude that had impressed Hayes from the beginning, acknowledging praise without letting it inflate his ego. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, a young black girl approached Malcolm timidly, clutching a beginner's flute case. "Mr. Johnson. Would you sign my case? I want to apply for your foundation's program next year." Malcolm looked momentarily stunned by the request, then recovered with a warm smile. "What's your name?" "Zoe Taylor." "I'm 12. "Well, Zoe Taylor, 12 is when I started getting serious about music too." He signed her case, then added, "Keep practicing, every day. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." As Zoe walked away, clutching the case to her chest, Malcolm turned to Hayes with an expression of wonder. "That was different." Hayes smiled. "Better get used to it. You're a role model now." The significance of that statement, a young black man from South Chicago becoming a role model in classical music spaces traditionally dominated by privilege, wasn't lost on either of them. As they left the hall together, Hayes, Lily, Malcolm, and Tanya, they formed an unlikely family unit bound not by blood but by circumstance, choice, and mutual respect. The boundary that had initially separated them on Flight 1459 had been not just crossed but dissolved, revealing the arbitrary nature of the division society creates. A crying baby on an airplane had been the catalyst for transformation, not just for individuals, but potentially for systems that had long perpetuated inequality. And as they stepped into the cool Boston evening, the future stretched before them like an unwritten composition, full of possibility and hope. What do you think about this story? Did it touch your heart or change your perspective on how we judge others? Comment below with your thoughts. If you believe in the power of unexpected connections to transform lives, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes our greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness crosses all boundaries. This story reminds us that prejudice creates artificial boundaries that rob us all of meaningful connections and opportunities. Malcolm's talent and kindness might never have been recognized had he stayed in his place as society expected. Similarly, Hayes' privilege could have insulated him from growth had he not recognized Malcolm's value beyond societal labels. The transformation we witness, from strangers divided by class and race to people united by mutual respect, demonstrates how authentic human connection can dismantle prejudice. Bennett's journey from outright bigotry to reluctant growth shows that even the most entrenched mindsets can evolve when confronted with undeniable evidence of their error. For Malcolm, courage meant risking rejection to help a crying child. For Hayes, it meant standing against prejudice despite potential business consequences. For Tiffany, it meant maintaining dignity while advocating for justice within an imperfect system. The story also highlights how privilege operates. Hayes' resources opened doors for Malcolm that talent alone couldn't unlock, revealing how systemic barriers prevent countless gifted individuals from reaching their potential. Perhaps most importantly, we see how a small act of kindness, helping a crying baby on a plane, can spark profound change. The choices we make in seemingly ordinary moments can alter the trajectory of multiple lives, creating ripples of transformation that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances. What unexpected connections have changed your life? Has someone ever crossed social boundaries to help you, or have you done the same for others? Share your story in the comments below. If this tale of courage, prejudice, and transformation resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge how we see each other. Don't forget to share this video with someone who might need a reminder that human connection transcends all artificial boundaries. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most beautiful relationships begin in the most unlikely circumstances.